Hajar, if you had a choice between a peaceful life while having unanswered questions about your family and going after the answers, which one would you choose?
That's a deep question. I think, given how the human brain works, it's difficult to settle for the unanswered questions, especially if there is even a tiny glimpse of hope of getting an answer.
Exactly. The novel today is built around the same dilemma.
So, what does the character in the novel choose then?
Well, I will unveil the answer as we explore today's novel.
All right. Welcome to Threads of Africa, a space where African voices, books, and ideas come alive. Each episode, we open the pages of books, narrations, and oral traditions that carry the rhythms, struggles, and dreams of the continent. I'm Hajar,
And I'm Ramdan.
and together we're weaving a richer understanding of Africa, one thread at a time.
In this episode, I will be talking about Jacaranda, a novel by Gaël Faye, a Rwandan-French singer, songwriter, rapper, and writer whose work sits at the crossroads of music, memory, and literature. We are discussing this book not only because Gaël Faye is Rwandan, so new country unlocked, but because Jacaranda is at its core a novel about Rwanda itself. The book is written in a delicate, restrained prose and traces the country's recent history, beginning in 1994, the year of the genocide in Rwanda, and at times reaching further back to earlier layers of Rwanda's past. And the story continues up until 2020. The main character is named Milan, a choice that immediately invites literary echoes, a quiet nod to Milan Kundera, and signals the novel's philosophical undertone, memory, exile, and the weight of inherited stories.
So, you mentioned Milan Kundera,
Yeah.
and for context for our listeners, he's a Czech French novelist. His best known work is The Unbearable Lightness of Being. And he actually went to exile in France in 1975, where he acquired French citizenship afterwards. Um, and this was due to the fact that his work was banned by the Communist Party in Czechoslovakia back then.
Thank you for providing this detail. Actually somehow thought that our listeners would know Milan Kundera since he's a well-known author. At least European listeners would know him, I guess. But I'm going to actually link back to the book you just mentioned by Milan Kundera and how it ties nicely to the story of this novel. So the title Jacaranda refers to a remarkable tree, typically growing between 20 and 30 meters tall. It's famous for its spectacular violet blue blossoms, and beyond its botanical beauty, the jacaranda carries deep symbolic meaning. In many cultures, it represents beauty, renewal, and serenity, a striking contrast to the violence and trauma the novel grapples with. In this way, the tree becomes a powerful metaphor, something rooted in the same soil as tragedy, yet capable of flowering again. I will come back to this. As you already know, we tried not to spoil the entire story, but we still want to make it compelling enough for you to listen. So rather than walking you through the plot, I will be exploring three main themes from Jacaranda, even though there is, of course, much more to unpack. The first theme I would like to discuss, and which runs from the very beginning of the novel till the end, is African parenting, and more specifically, the relationship between the narrator and his mother, who is from Rwanda. So I found this relationship quite familiar, typical, I would say, of many parenting styles in Africa. It's emotionally reserved, shaped by history, and grounded more in duty than in verbal affection.
That sounds familiar indeed. Yep.
Yeah. So the second theme is the search for purpose. How one finds meaning in life, even when there are many possibilities, and yet we are haunted by things from the past that we haven't even lived. And here I'm getting a bit philosophical, but one could almost title this section Exile. Not just geographical exile, but also existential exile. A feeling of being slightly out of place in one's own life. And still, I want to keep search for purpose as the lens here, because the novel is less about displacement than about orientation. It's about how to choose a direction when the past keeps pulling at you quietly but persistently. And the novel doesn't give clear answers, I believe, to this. And the third theme is inevitably the genocide, not treated as a historical lesson, but as a presence, something that structures lives, silences relationships, and choices long after the events themselves took place. So we have three themes, but there is no particular reason for this order. I could start with any of them, but I would do my best to remain coherent. And for the sake of suspense, I may keep some of the most revealing elements, especially those related to Milan's mother, at for the end of this episode. This is also a way of staying faithful to the novel's own rhythm, which reveals its emotional core gradually rather than all at once. Now, before we move on to discussing the themes, and you might have guessed this, I want to tell you a bit more about the author. Gaël Faye was born in Africa, in Bujumbura, the capital city of Burundi, in 1982. His father is French and his mother is Rwandan. And Gaël Faye spent his childhood in Burundi until the outbreak of the civil war in, I believe, 1993, and the Rwandan genocide in 1994. He left Burundi for France in 1995, which means he was actually there when the tragedy happened. And if you don't do the math, you realize he was 13 at the time, right? So, I mean, old enough to understand what was happening around him and young enough for it to leave a lasting mark. Gaël Faye is, above all, an artist. Many people know him as a singer and songwriter, and Hajar, I believe you listened to his music long before I did, because I actually discovered him thanks to you.
Yeah, actually, I was surprised when I saw his name on the book. I was wondering if it's the same Gaël Faye when I saw it on the book. As you said, I knew him mainly as a singer, and indeed, as you mentioned, he is a well-rounded artist. And I even discovered recently that he wrote and directed a documentary film called Rwanda, le silence des mots, Rwanda, the silence of words, which, as you might have guessed, shows testimonies about the Rwandan genocide, specifically from women who endured sexual violence.
Yeah, sounds interesting. But now I'm about to tell you something you probably didn't know about him. Did you know that he worked in finance?
What? No.
Yeah, he has
Unexpected.
he has a master's degree in finance and worked for a London-based investment fund for 2 years.
Okay.
But as with many great artists, there was always that pull toward his true passion. He eventually left the British capital and probably, I guess, a decent salary. He was in
Mhm.
finance. And he left the British capital to devote himself fully to his arts. And it certainly paid off, I would say.
Yeah, interesting. And also, I must say, it's a good transition then from our last podcast episode about Tijiantiam. So,
Tiantian,
from
yeah,
finance to art.
yeah,
Yeah.
true. In 2009, he released an album with his group Milk, Coffee and Sugar. And in 2013, Gaël Faye released his first solo album. The title was Pili Pili sur un croissant de beurre. No, Pili Pili sur croissant au beurre.
Which, by the way, literally translates to chili pepper on a butter croissant. And pili pili in Swahili means pepper or chili.
Yes, a perfect title to describe his work, a mix of sweetness and sharpness.
And I would say the cultural mix that he comes from, right? East African and
Yeah,
French.
true, true. Gaël Faye excels across all the artistic forms he engages with. And if winning prizes is any indicator of excellence, even though we all know many incredible artists never win any, it's fair to say that his talent resonates widely. His first solo album earned him the Prix Charles Cros des lycéens for new francophone music. And in February 2018, he won the Victoire de la Musique Award for Life Breakthrough Artist. And that's not all. Alongside his music career, Gaël Faye is also a writer. He published his first semi autobiographical novel, Petit Pays, which recounts the childhood of a young boy in Burundi against the backdrop of political violence. So the novel was widely praised by critics and readers alike and received numerous literary awards and firmly established him as a major voice in contemporary francophone literature. So now, if you didn't know him before, you have many good reasons to be curious about the man, the music, the books, and I think all of these led us to Jacaranda today. Now, before I dive into the first theme, which I said would be about African parenting, I'm going to ask you for just for a moment to forget everything I've told you about the author Gaël Faye, because from now on, I'll be talking about the main character of the novel, Milan. Hajar, did you guess why?
Because Milan looks very much like Gaël Faye.
Well, not physically, perhaps.
Or I mean, like his story is very similar.
Yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, you got it right. So just like the author himself, Milan is born to a French father and a Rwandan mother. And under this first theme, I want to explore at least two or maybe three African parenting relationship that run through the story. And first, I will talk about the relationship between Milan and his mother, which is the most central one and perhaps the most telling. And second, the relationship between Stella, another key character in the novel, and her mother, Zubi, and great grandmother, Rosalie. So in the book, this lineage allows the reader to see how motherhood's memory and survival evolve across generations. Now, there are many more stories I could share around this first theme, such as the relationship between Milan's mother, who's called Financia, and her own mother, so Milan's grandmother, where it's a relationship where silence, transmission, and trauma take on a different generational form. But I will keep it to the first two stories, otherwise, these episodes might get too lengthy. Milan was born and raised in France. He experienced the Rwandan genocide through television.
Unlike the author himself, right? As you said, who was in Burundi as the genocide happened.
Yeah, true. And if you are familiar with African geography, you would know that Burundi is very close to Rwanda. In fact, they are more or less the same kind of people,
Yeah.
I would say. Yeah. So, yes, the main character, Milan, saw the violence through TV. He saw the images, and as he saw the images on TV, he kept looking at his mother, questioning her with his eyes, longing to hear something, anything about what was happening in her country. But the answer was always the same: silence. And yet, Milan remembers seeing images of the war, images of violence, of massive numbers of corpses on television almost every evening for months. Long story short, that year, his school performance dropped significantly and he had to repeat the year at school. And there is a story here that's funny, but also quite deep. And I will link it back to the last theme on genocide later. The story goes like this: his teachers eventually ask him what explained his poor results, right? And without thinking too much, he replied, because of the war. Now imagine this: a young adolescent in France who has only seen the war on television saying that a conflict happening thousands of kilometers away is the reason of his failure at school. So everyone was shocked. They saw it as a blatant lie. And this information eventually reaches his parents, and you can probably guess the reaction: a slap in the face from his father, and days of silence from his mom. Not a single word from the mom. Now, Milan may have lied, at least formally, by attributing his failure to a war taking place far away. But I think it's fair to ask if it was really a lie. Because remember, he knew the war was happening in his mother's country, possibly also to his mother's family, and yet she never said a word about it. That, in my view, is quite typical of an African parenting style. Parents often avoid difficult topics. Education tends to be very top down, through looks, through silence. Certain topics become taboo, and no one is allowed to raise them, least of all children. And that can be a real issue for curious child, I think. Milan clearly longs for answers from his mother during that time, answers that might have helped him think less about the war and focus more on his studies, but he never received any. So to me, this feels like a form of mental punishment and could well explain a poor performance at school.
I totally agree with you on the point of parenting, but I think there is another aspect here, which you did not mention, which is the lack of empathy from both the father, who is French, as you have explained, and the teachers. I mean, it's presumptuous and ignorant to assume that a war in the child's home country, even if he never lived there, does not affect him emotionally and mentally. And I find it completely wrong to name it a lie. Just because the crisis affects people who don't look like them, and I mean the teachers here and the father, and with whom they don't identify, they could improve empathy for the child. And for them, the war in Rwanda was news and the victims were numbers. While for the child, these people could be his cousins or distant uncles or aunts. And
Yeah, you're right. You're right. Because at some point, the war came even closer. One day, a young boy named Claude arrived at their home, and his head was heavily bandaged, the result of what can only be described as a violent machete blow meant to simply kill him. And this injury came directly from the war that was happening in Rwanda. So Claude was introduced to Milan by his mother as her nephew. But if someone says they have a nephew, it usually means they have siblings, right? So Milan naturally started asking questions about his mother's brothers and sisters, and once again, he got no answers. So we later learn that Claude was much more than just a nephew. I will come back to this. And Claude stayed with Milan's family for some time in France, and the two boys bonded until one day Milan was tricked by his mother, and Claude was sent back to Rwanda. The details of how this happened, you will find them in the book. But fast forward 4 years later, so in 1998, because I said the book starts in 1994. In 1998, Milan's parents announced their divorce. And at the same time, Milan was offered the opportunity to travel to Rwanda for the first time with his mother, quote unquote, to meet the mother's family in Rwanda. So when they arrived in the country, Milan discovered something he had never known before, which is that he had a grandmother. And Claude was not his cousin or his mom's nephew. He was actually his mother's half brother, though not from the same mother. And this is perhaps an extreme case of an African parenting style, I would say. And in this instance, it can only be understood or at least explained by the mother's past. At least that's how I understand it now. Once that's how you would also probably understand it once you read through the entire story.
so was the grandfather polygamous? Or did
Yeah, he
he?
had a another wife. Well,
Okay.
now I think it's fair to say that Milan's mother is somewhat of a mysterious character. Well, it becomes clear later in the book, but when you start reading it, she's kind of mysterious.
Yeah.
uh, but this first trip to Rwanda ends up opening more questions than it gives answers to Milan. First, his mother disappears the day after they arrive in Kigali, the capital city of Rwanda, leaving him nothing more than rather a vague note.
Does she come back?
You know later.
Okay.
um, but yeah, there are many powerful stories from these first visits to Rwanda. So first, let's move to another family and to continue discussing African parenting. Uh, During that first visit, and after his mother finally returns from her long absence,
Okay. So she's not lost.
no, Milan. After that, Milan meets with one of his mother's teenage friends named Eusebi,
Mhm.
along with her newborn at the time called Stella. And Stella also had a great grandmother living with them in the house. So Stella would later become a central character in the novel. Many pages are devoted to her relationship with her mom and with her great grandmother, and also with a magnificent, almost magical Jacaranda tree. So, kind of linking back
So the
to the title.
Jacaranda tree is the one that Stella owns, or the one which is in Stella's home, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. It stood in their home. But I will come back to this. And just to add one more detail, Stella doesn't have a father. Her mom had her alone, so to speak.
Yeah.
Look, the book is 300 page. It's a 300-page novel. So of course I can't tell the entire story in a single podcast episode, but I hope that all of the things that I've just said have given you enough background to understand how the story unfolds. Um, what is important here is that Stella and her mother barely had a relationship. Stella spent most of her childhood either perchée sur le jacaranda, perched in the jacaranda tree, where she claimed to hear voices, and later in the book, we understand why this made a certain spiritual sense. Um, so she's either on the tree or with her great grandmother, listening to her great grandmother. Her great grandmother told her her entire life story, and because she was very old, that story was in many ways the entire history of the country. Again, I'll come back to this. Now, unlike with her mom, Stella was extremely close with her great grandmother, as I just said.
So she was brought up by her great grandmother.
Yeah, basically, until her passing, at
Yeah.
least. Now, I don't know how common this is in Western families, but I've seen this pattern myself. I have a cousin who was much, much closer to our grandmother than to his own mother. And this does happen in certain African families where children don't always grow up with their biological parents. That wasn't Stella's case because she was physically in the same house with her mom. But what I meant is that sometimes there are kids raised by an aunt or an uncle to the point where they don't develop a strong emotional bond with their own parents. I can think of many examples in my own family, and there are cases where, for instance, someone in the family cannot conceive, and a relative decides to leave one of their children with that person, and that child then grows up with them. Although, in most cases, the child knows who their biological parent is.
This is an interesting point. And we discussed this before recording the episode. Uh, As you said, I also know of some cases in my distant family, but the practice is becoming less common and more frowned upon. Specifically, you won't find this anymore in urban and westernized families. Whether it's a good or a bad thing, I don't know. In my view, it's related to the concept of quote unquote, it takes a village to raise a child.
Yeah.
And in traditional African societies, the boundaries of the nuclear family did not exist as we know them. So, mother, father, children. So the child is usually raised by a village, meaning the wider family, the grandparents, the aunts, the uncles, etc., the neighbors even. And now young families always complain that they lack the support to raise a family because it's very difficult to work full time and raise children. So people pay money to get this village back as a service, be it through nannies, babysitters, etc. Anyways, it's just food for thought, and also a point on the fact that progress does not always mean that life is getting easier.
Yeah, you're right. That's an excellent point. So, to close this section, I will leave you with a dialogue between Milan and his mother that takes place later in the storyline. And this scene happened in 2010. And yes, you can tell that I have changed quite a bit from 1998, but bear with me. Milan was preparing another trip to Rwanda, this time on his own, when he asked his mother why she won't come with him. And she replies, "There is nothing to understand. I left almost 40 years ago. It's no longer my country. I chose my life. I chose to turn the page. Who does that bother?" And Milan answers, "Me, mom. It bothers me because I don't know the page you turned. You never read it to me." And his mother replies, "Stop with that ridiculous metaphor." And Milan says, "But you're the one who just used it." Now, at this point, his mom abruptly ends the discussion by saying, "Milan, you're getting on my nerves with all your questions." And he answers simply, "And you, mom, with your silences."
Actually, I have a question. So we talked about parenting in this theme, and you said that the mom was mysterious, secretive, but also reserved, doesn't share her emotion. I'm wondering if anywhere in the book it comes out clearly, even if it's subtle, that the mom loves her child. Or otherwise, how does she express her love to her child?
She doesn't really.
Okay.
Well, at least that's my reading. But it's it's African parents style, parenting style, right? The way African parents express their love to their kids.
I mean, yeah, obviously they won't say "I love you," but at least they express their love by ensuring that their children survive, that they get a good education, they get good nutrition, things like that. I don't know.
No, yeah, you're right. But yeah, in their case, I don't think there was any issue for the mom to worry about Milan's education or things like that. Of course, she wanted him to succeed in life. She wanted him to, stay very far away from
trouble.
From Rwanda.
Which means from trouble, I guess. No?
Well, that's not really. That was trouble for the mom, but
Yeah.
not for
In her point of view. Yeah.
So yeah, maybe that was one expression of love in her case. But yeah, there was also a very interesting thing towards the end, which I guess could answer your question about how the mom expressed love.
Yeah.
Now, this dialogue is, I think, a perfect transition to the next theme I want to explore in this episode, which I said earlier is going to be about the search for purpose in life. So in 2005, Milan decides to go back to Rwanda for his field work as part of his bachelor's thesis. And his plan was to work on the Tribunaux Populaires de la Réconciliation, which in English would translate to Community Courts and Reconciliation. So locally in Rwanda, these are known as the Gacaca courts. And as you can imagine, his mom was completely against the idea.
Yeah.
She formally forbids him from reaching out to her family to ask any questions about the past, she tells him it is unacceptable in the culture to do these kind of things, and that it would be considered as impolite. Now, you will soon understand why I gave this section its title, because here is a young man who arguably has every reason to ignore Rwanda and its history and simply carry on with his life in France. But no, he doesn't want that. He breaks up with his girlfriend and makes the trip to Rwanda against the will of his Rwandan mother. So you see, there is clearly a form of quest for meaning in all this, a search for purpose that pushes him to confront what his mom never allowed him to know. Anyway, 2005, Milan went back to Rwanda for his thesis. He then travels back again in 2010, and later on, yet another time, always driven by more or less the same impulse, wanting to know more about the country and about his family history. At some point, he quits his job. Life in France feels a bit too dull for him, and it seems that it is only in Kigali that things really happened. And here, I think Gaël Faye succeeds in making a quiet note to Milan Kundera, whom you mentioned earlier,
Yep.
especially to his novel The Unbearable Lightness of Being, which is a philosophical book about love, freedom, identity, and the way history weighs in private lives.
Yep.
And just like in Kundera's work, Milan's story raises the question of whether a life lived lightly, detached from history, responsibility, and memory is truly free or simply empty. France represents comfort, stability, and even ease in Milan's life. And Rwanda, on the other hand, represents weight, history, unanswered questions, and moral gravity. Milan seems drawn to that weight, as if meaning can only emerge where life is heavy, where traces matter, where history presses in, and where one cannot simply float through existence. And this is important because, for instance, Milan inherited money from his French grandfather. He could have lived comfortably in France, invested that inheritance, and carried on with his life, but instead he chooses to go to Rwanda and spend that money there, arguably quite recklessly. I'm not telling you the details of how he spent the money because I don't want to spoil the story, but all of this points to the same thing, a quest for meaning in Milan's life. What do you think about that? Why are you laughing? It's deep, right?
Yeah, I actually I believe this hits home very deeply for many from the African diaspora or Afro descendants who live in developed countries, mostly in the West. And that applies to us both, I guess, as well. Many of us have that longing to go back to Africa. And if you dig deeper, it is driven by that need to find a meaning in life. Um, that the more comfortable life in the West does not fulfill.
True.
And I think that is kind of the core of what Milan's story is about.
Yeah, I agree with you. And I do think that the same pattern holds for many other characters in the novel. As you will see in the next theme that I'm about to talk about, which is the genocide, or more precisely, surviving memory of the genocide, you will see the constant quest of meaning, especially for people that lived through the genocide or those whose family history is tightly
Got
linked.
affected.
or affected by what happened in the past, although themselves have not lived the event.
And in this case, obviously, it's not just about finding meaning in one's own life, but also, or a very important layer of that meaning is justice as well, which adds to the complexity to the story.
True. So now let's move on to that third theme, the genocide. Whenever he's in Rwanda, my reading is that Milan is surrounded by people who are driven by the same necessity, a perpetual questioning of the country's history and a lingering memory of what happened during the genocide and how it's kept alive, often unwillingly. Now, I won't spoil the stories here. Instead, what I'm going to do simply is reflect on how 4 of the characters lived through or experienced the genocide. These characters would include Claude.
So the young boy who came
his mom's younger brother. And one of Claude's friends named Sartre. And the young girl Stella. Remember, Stella is his Milan's mother's friend's daughter.
And the one who has a Jacaranda tree in her home.
Yeah. And Milan himself.
Yeah. And here you named the new character Sartre, and there we see another tribute to yet another French philosopher and novelist, obviously Jean-Paul Sartre, who...
No, it's not obvious.
Okay. Anyways, he's a Nobel Prize laureate in literature. He got it in 1964, and he even tried to refuse the prize, but anyways, that's a story for another time.
Yeah.
And he's one of the key figures of the philosophy of existentialism. Actually, he used to be one of my favorite philosophers when I was at school.
Oh, cool.
And in his prominent book, Being and Nothingness, in French, L'être et le néant, Sartre's primary idea is that humans are, quote unquote, condemned to be free, and that life's meaning is what we choose it to be. And there is a strong emphasis on the choice in existentialist philosophy.
You're going too deep.
Yeah. Anyways, without digressing too much and without being too philosophical, I believe there is a link here to the previous theme related to Milan's choice to find meaning by going back to Rwanda, despite all of the odds.
Yeah. Well, thank you for talking about Sartre. By the way, I'm currently reading a book by a Tunisian author, and the book was prefaced by Jean-Paul Sartre. I'm just saying.
Which book?
That might be hints of future episodes.
Okay, I'm curious.
Now, all of these 4 characters in different ways feel compelled to carry the memory of the genocide.
Yeah, and before we carry on, maybe a bit of pause and some history break
About
the Rwandan genocide, obviously. And also to put things in context, and you even talked about the Rwandan Civil War. So there is a Rwandan Civil War, which took place between 1990 and 1994. And that was fought between the Rwandan armed forces, so the government, basically, and the rebel Rwandan Patriotic Front, the RPF. And the war itself arose from the long-running dispute between the Hutu and the Tutsi. So these are 2 major ethnic groups in Rwanda. And the enmity between these 2 ethnic groups started as the Rwandan Revolution in 1959 replaced the Tutsi monarchy with a Hutu-led republic. And this has forced more than 330,000 Tutsi to seek refuge in the neighboring countries. Then a group of these refugees in Uganda founded the RPF, we talked about, and the RPF obviously came back and started the civil war. The genocide itself happened in 1994, so the last year of the civil war, and that's between that was between April and July of the same year, where between 500,000 to 1 million of Tutsi and moderate Hutus were killed by Hutu militia. And the genocide was marked by extreme violence. You might have heard about some of the stories where the victims often are murdered by neighbors using machetes, as in the case of the mother's brother. What's his name?
Claude.
Yeah. And not only violence, again, as we said about the film that Gaël Faye directed, there was widespread sexual violence as well. And despite the scale of the atrocities, the international community failed to intervene and stop the killings. Now the RPF resumed military operations in response to the genocide and eventually defeated the government forces and ended the genocide by capturing all government-controlled territory. And the RPF took over the government. For reference, the current Rwandan president, Paul Kagame, is one of the leaders of the RPF, which remains one of the dominant political forces in the country.
Well, thank you for that history lesson. Although I think this is the formal kind of version of the story.
Yeah.
If you read the books, you will read about, the untold parts.
Yeah.
Some that's kind of linked to colonial history.
Yeah.
But yeah, let me go back to the characters, and perhaps I would be able to explain more. So Claude and Sartre lived through the genocide. Milan and Stella did not. And yet it almost feels as though they live it through their family members who were there when it happened. Remember what I said about Claude's forehead, right? During one of the Gacaca courts that I mentioned earlier, Claude comes face to face with the man who tried to kill him and confronted him. He was being tried. So the Gacaca courts are described in the book in great detail. They take place outdoors in nature and are attended by almost everyone. During the session that concerns Claude, he gives a chilling testimony describing in horrifying detail the genocidal scenes he witnessed, how he survived, and how the machete blow to his head failed to kill him. I will leave it to you to discover how he made it out of this alive by reading the book. But he also talks about how this continues to affect his life. And it's deeply unsettling when you think about it, because these are not just abstract characters. Because people like Claude are still alive today in Rwanda. Some survivors still experience flashes even today. And to some extent, this also affects people who were not even born at the time. I will refer to this when I will be talking about Milan and Stella. So the author, Gaël Faye, here does a very powerful job describing how ordinary people continue to live with the impact of the genocide decades later. And on the other side, some of those who participated in the genocide are still being tried, and others are still out there.
Yeah.
And here I want to share something personal. I once worked very closely with someone, and out of simple curiosity, I typed his name into Google. And I found out he had been a minister in Rwanda in the years before 1994. So the year you described as...
the year of the genocide.
No,
the Civil War,
yeah. So he was a minister in the country, in the government of the president back then, Habyarimana. I won't say which ministry, but it couldn't have been closer to everything that happened.
Yeah, and I think your point here is that the people who participated in the genocide are still among us, in a sense, right? They're still here.
For me, it was, for days I was thinking about it.
Yeah.
Because there are pages and pages written about the person.
Yeah.
Online.
Yeah. So actually, you talked about the Gacaca courts. So what happens after the court? Okay, people talk about what happened and know who is the victim and who is the perpetrator, and then
whatever happens after someone is judged.
okay, so they're judged.
Yeah.
And they go to prison?
I will leave it to
read the book?
discover by reading the book.
Yeah.
Now Sartre, the other character, Sartre lived through the genocide. He was a Hutu, though.
Okay.
So not among those who were being targeted during the genocide, but he played a very important role. And that role is so critical that it explains his closeness to both Claude and Milan in the book. But again, not giving you the details.
Okay.
And then there is Stella. She was born in 1998, so remember right before the first visits of Milan and his mom to Rwanda.
Yeah.
And therefore 4 years after the genocide. But remember what I said earlier. She was made a kind of custodian of the country's history by her great-grandmother. And through Stella, the story of how everything started is told, going all the way back to colonial times. So that's the untold history that you don't you won't find necessarily online.
Yeah.
Because a lot of what happened in 1994 has roots in the colonial era, long before the genocide itself. Again, this part of the book is worth reading. Beyond the stories she was told, Stella also had a very particular relationship with a Jacaranda tree.
Yeah, the tree they have in their home, to which she speaks. Oh no, to which she listens.
And as I mentioned earlier, she was almost always in it. Let me say just a bit more about that tree. In the book, it's presented as something close to sacred for Stella, almost haunted. It's a place where she hears voices. And you may ask whose voices, right?
Yeah, the ancestors. The victims.
Yeah. You're getting there.
But it's it's kind of expected, I would say, because in many of the quote unquote animist religions, you have ancestor spirits who live in trees and elements of nature.
Yes, you're right. Yeah, people very close to her.
Yeah.
Actually. Well, you have to read the book to find out who exactly, and also to discover what ultimately happens to the tree, and why it was so important that the book's title was Jacaranda.
Yep.
Now, Milan, remember, everything his mother never told him kept drawing him back to Rwanda, and his last trip to Rwanda in the novel is in many ways dedicated to her. I won't tell you more about what happened to Milan's mother.
Yeah.
But during that visit, Milan learns more about his mother's past, and we would discover that she had a twin sister, and that there was someone she loved before going into exile in France, where she later met Milan's father. And her exile was driven by a tragic story that took place in the year 1973 during a massacre of Tutsi students, which is a tragedy that's also deeply strained the relationship between Milan's mother and his grandmother. Remember, I said there was also, I mentioned earlier that there was an interesting African parenting dynamic there also.
Between the mother and the grandmother.
Yeah, so it's kind of between what happened to Milan's mom's sister, twin sister, and and the tragic events of 1973.
Yeah.
So that was the thing that strained the
The
relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah. But anyway, during that visit, Milan finally hears more about his mother's story. And to close this narration, I want to leave you with a moment that shows how present the genocide still is in Rwandan society. So, for context, every year there is a remembrance period. April 7 in Rwanda marks the start of the 1994 genocide against the Tutsi and is observed every year as a national day of remembrance. And during one of these commemorations, Milan recounts the following scene, quote unquote, beside me, a young woman stared at the sky with a crazed look. She was reliving her execution. She kept repeating, mercy, mercy. The past was present. The genocide is still ongoing.
And so we close our journey through Jacaranda by Gaël Faye, a novel about memory, inheritance, and the weight of what is left unsaid. It remains as that silence does not erase history, it merely delays its return. And that sometimes the most radical choice is not comfort, but the decision to ask questions no one wants to answer. If this story sparked something in you, pass it on, just like oral tradition.
And read the book.
And read the book. You've been listening to Threads of Africa with Ramdan and Hajar. A bientôt and stay curious.